What has been your most bone-chilling, hair-raising, let's get the hell out of here experience? I'm a criminal defense investigator. I had a murder case involving two brothers. The one accused of the murders was very autistic, and his brother was a schizophrenic. The schizophrenic brother lived in a potato shack in the middle of the desert. I needed to talk to him several times throughout the course of the investigation, and since he didn't have a phone or electricity, I had to drive several hours out to his house and yell his name from the fence line until he came out of the shack. This investigation lasted for several years, and over time I developed a rapport with schizophrenic brother, and I kind of got to like him. He would talk your ear off about the aliens with golden eyes and the underground tunnels that connect all the Walmarts in the country, but he was pretty entertaining, and part of me wonders how much of it was a show. Schizophrenic brother eventually gets a girlfriend. She's a tweaker who has mistaken his schizophrenia for meth-induced psychosis. I talked to her a few times in jail when she was sober, and she was surprisingly charming and insightful. The last time I go to see schizophrenic brother, it's a dark winter night and tweaker girlfriend is there. She's lurking in the shadows and staring daggers at me the entire time I'm talking to him. I cut off his conversation about the speakers in his fillings and walked back to my truck to leave. A minute later, schizophrenic brother comes running out and tells me that he wants to show me something in his shack. He's never invited me inside before, and I'm not thrilled by the prospect. The whole thing feels off to me, so I tell him I have to get going, and start the truck. The look of relief on his face when I declined to go inside convinced me that tweaker girlfriend was waiting behind the door with a hammer or something. A few months later I learned that she shot him in his sleep and stashed his body in an old refrigerator. She has since pleaded guilty to his murder. 2019 summer, I was house sitting for my dad while he was away for work. The house is in the middle of nowhere and barely even on Google Maps. Usually when friends would come over I would have to drive to the top of the nearest paved road and lead them down a few more I-paved streets to my dad's place. I had had a few drinks with friends and been dropped off by a friend that lived close by. He dropped me at the side of the house because it was easier for him to turn around there. So I walked up the stairs and entered with my key through the side door that led to the kitchen. The kitchen overlooked the front garden, but the front door was nestled into a small porch and wasn't visible to me. I saw movement in the front garden while I was making tea in the kitchen and immediately turned off the lights. There was a man trying to look into the kitchen windows from the garden. He ended up walking around to the wall-to-ceiling glass doors around the back of the house, cupping his hands to the glass and trying to look in. I wasn't completely sober that night, so I remember just thinking the situation didn't seem real. He couldn't see me in the dark, but I was hiding behind the wall that separated the kitchen from the dining/lounge area. I had stupidly not locked one of the glass doors closer to the front door, and he started entering the house, in the pitch black, not realizing I was maybe 10 feet away from him. I had already called the friend who had dropped me off as I knew he was still nearby, knowing his parents kept a gun and a safe in the truck. I remember just wanting to run, get out of the house ASAP. The situation didn't feel real at all, like something from a movie. I was acting on adrenaline. But if I ran, I'd be alone in the middle of nowhere with a deranged man chasing after me. As the guy walked further into the house, I stepped out and pulled a knife on him. Again, I was not sober. It was a very stupid thing to do. He tried to incoherently make conversation, but I got him out of the door just as my friend pulled up with his gun. The dude bolted to his car that was parked in an area concealed by trees on the property. Turns out he was the gardener. He had been keeping tabs on me, knew I was house sitting alone for my dad while he was out of town, was very high on meth, which he admitted to me while I had the knife out, and had been waiting on the front porch for me to come home. Except I had used the side door that night, something I usually never did. If I hadn't have used the side door that night, I have no idea what would have happened. I also have no idea what would have happened if my friend hadn't come back when I called him, because the guy was starting to get aggressive and trying to come towards me right when my friend got there with his gun out. We like to joke about it now, but it was the worst scenario I have ever experienced. When I was about 11, this house down the street from my grandparents had a reputation for being haunted. One day I was walking to the shop to get supplies for my grandparents and I saw the owner of the house outside. He was about my dad's age and started talking to me. I really wanted to be the first of my friends to go in the haunted house, and I was asking a million questions about ghosts and stuff, and he told me I could come in and see if I wanted. I said I had to go do my errands, but he was pretty convincing and promised he wouldn't tell anyone. So up his driveway and into the haunted house we went, but I heard him lock the door when we got in, and for some reason I was hyper aware of it. I said I'd changed my mind, and he kind of blocked me from the door, trying to change my mind and calling me a scaredy cat and stuff. I don't remember exactly what happened for him to let me out, but he did, and I ran for my life. Sat at the shop for ages just shaking and wanting to puke without even knowing what I was scared of. Anyway, turned out later it wasn't a haunted house. The guy was a pedophile and serial child rapist. His house burned down while he was in prison. Okay, so I'm in middle school. 6th grade I think, and to get my bus in the morning I had to walk about a mile or so to the back of our neighborhood. About 6 a.m. I'm chilling waiting for the bus alone. This man walks up to me and I can't remember what he was talking about, but I do remember him trying to get me to go to a house across the street. I kept telling him no and that if I miss my bus I'm getting my ass whooped, early 90s SMH. The more I said no, the more agitated he got, and I remember being more scared than I've ever been, and trying to figure out where I could run. I'm literal trying to gauge if I could jump into a bayou that's catty corner to us and not die. But like a fucking boss, my old elementary school bus driver comes hauling us down the street, stops the bus and flies out the door screaming at the guy who runs to a car parked in front of the house he was trying to get me to go to and drives off. She bangs on the door to the house and they tell her everyone who lives there is accounted for and they have no idea who the man was. She took me home, and from that day on my stop changed to a block away from my house. Her name was Ms. Francine, and I'm convinced she saved my life that morning. I'm in my 40s now, but telling the story to my kids still makes me sick to my stomach. I was walking from a local shopping mall to the train station so I could go home. The shortcut went through a huge long tunnel and was out of sight from the road, and wasn't used unless you knew the area. When I got to the tunnel I looked up and saw one guy standing right at the other end of the tunnel, in the middle, just looking in my direction. Like he was waiting. Every hair on my body stood on end. I felt like I needed to vomit, and before I knew what I was doing my feet turned me around and started walking fast away. He started walking after me and said, "Don't worry, it's not like I'm going to rape you." I ran and walked right on the edge of a highway in plain view of cars in case he ran after me. I couldn't stop shaking for an hour. When I was 27 my girlfriend lived in a crappy part of Hollywood, Florida near US 1. She had a kid pretty young, but the dad ended up going to jail for assault. The only place she could afford was run down as hell, with all sorts of addicts and genuine lowlifes living in the units around her. She hated the place. She couldn't move in with me because I was just renting a room where I lived. It was better than living at her parents', though she had a drunk abusive dad and an addict mom. I went to visit her after my shift ended at 9 p.m. Picked up some food and planned to cook for her. We were there for about an hour just sitting on the couch watching her kid play with a box. Then the banging on the door started. She looks terrified thinking it's her ex. I'm kind of freaked out too because I heard all these stories about him. Some guy is cursing, hitting something against the door really hard. We don't even want to peek through the window or peephole thinking he's got a gun. We call the police but the operator is having a tough time hearing. Then we hear some other woman screaming and cursing. He had the wrong door. We hear them start fighting. Smashing, more screaming. Sounds like she's spitting and we hear punches. We're not sure if it's her or him but it's loud. 911 operator says police are on their way. The kid starts screaming because he's scared. The man outside starts banging on the door again. He thinks his kid is with us and shouts he's going to kill us for taking his kid. My GF just breaks down at this point and starts crying. Maybe 10 minutes later the police arrive. They arrest both of them, then took our statements. She moved out a couple days later and we ended up renting another crappy apartment, but in a much better area. Hiking in the Rocky Mountains, on a trail I knew pretty well. I was leading a group of kids, maybe 20 or so middle school aged children from the camp where I worked. I turned a corner and saw a jawbone of a deer. Pretty cool, showed it to the kids. Didn't have any flesh on it, so I assumed it was pretty old. 100 feet further down the trail I find another bone. Femur maybe. This one looked a little fresher. Another ways down, another bone. I'm getting a little nervous at this point, so I explain that we should probably turn around and head back. My students all groan that they want to see more dead stuff, but I shepherd them down the train and back to camp. 2 days later we got a call at the camp that someone had been attacked in the area by a mountain lion. Apparently a mountain lion had set itself up in the caves on the cliffside and it had gotten pissed when someone got too close. I'm glad we left the area, even if my students would have loved to see more dead stuff. Possibly fighting a house fire, and realizing that I had very hot feet. Through concrete-soled boots? My officer and I immediately noped the fuck out. Hot feet mean you're standing above a fire. As fire burns upwards, it's weakening the floor beneath you. So we were about to plummet into a basement fire. I worked a lot in remote areas of West Texas, servicing oil field-related equipment. One time I was out in the middle of nowhere as usual, and to the northeast was a butte, an isolated hill that's bigger than a regular hill but smaller than a mountain, but everywhere else around was pretty flat. There was one road in and out of the site I was at. At some point when I was working on a control box, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the horizon, looked all around the butte, and went back to work. This happened a few more times within several minutes until I finally saw something move on the side of one of the rock outcroppings on the butte. I went to my truck, grabbed my binoculars, and the figure hid behind that outcropping. It was definitely a human. I glassed him for a good 20 minutes and I could see him peek around every couple of minutes. Eventually he leaned out so far that I could see the silhouette of the barrel of a rifle slung around his back. At some point he was hidden behind his rock for a while, and the next time he peeked out, I couldn't see the rifle. He had either put it down somewhere or he was now holding it. I immediately felt a sense of impending doom. The hair on my arms and neck was standing straight up. I very quickly collected my tools, got my AR-15 from behind the driver's seat and sat it on the passenger seat, and tore out of there. I sped down the dirt road, almost clipped the cattle guard, and started cruising down the highway just as the adrenaline started to wear off. I remember the metal taste in my mouth and having to grip the steering wheel to keep my fingers from twitching. A few miles down the road, a maroon Suburban full of guys was pulled over on the oncoming side of the road. They definitely weren't oil field workers, shades all around, buzzed heads, all intently looking at me. I expected them to pull a U-turn and pursue me, but they didn't. I can't prove that this is what was happening, but I do know that cartel guys run operations where one scouts for guys working alone and calls in a group of guys to rob them of their truck and tools. A friend and I were exploring an abandoned factory in North Philadelphia about 8 years ago, and when we got to about the 3rd floor I discovered a booby trap in the stairwell. Basically it was a tripwire that swung an axe down from the ceiling. Right as that fully set in, we heard someone from up above shout, "Yo." I've never covered that much ground so fast. I think we were 2 or 3 blocks away before we realized we were riding each other's bikes. Once when I was like 8 years old I lived in a trailer park with mostly normal but occasionally sketchy folks around. I was really bored at home and asked my parents if I could walk up the street to my friend's house. It was like the middle of the day and we knew a lot of people on our street, so my parents said yes. So here I am, an 8-year-old little girl walking to my friend's house. Just as I got out of sight I saw an adult man walking towards me straight ahead. I immediately have my alerts on cause I was alone of course and had never seen this dude before. I keep hoping he veers off on another course away from me, but he keeps coming towards me and I notice his eyes are locked on me and he's smiling. I got the creeps, but I was pretty close to my friend's house now. I looked around and realized there wasn't anyone else outside to witness anything. He finally gets close enough to say something to me and this is what made me run. He said, "Hey, do you think you could take your shoes off? Please, I want to see your feet." And I said, "Huh? What?" And he asked me again to see my feet. Y'all, I turned around and sprinted so fast back to my house. I was terrified. I used to work on an ambulance and the company that I worked for had more ambulances than there were firehouses/medic stations, so we would do something called posting, which is where you park the ambulance somewhere within the area that you are servicing while you wait for a call. I was working the midnight to 10 a.m. shift one night and it was really slow. On slow nights, we would try to find the darkest areas we could find to post in an attempt to catch some sleep. We find a church within a neighborhood whose parking lot had virtually no light, so we decide to park there. As soon as my partner put the rig in park, I instantly felt incredibly uncomfortable and unsafe. I didn't want to say anything to my partner as I literally had no reason to feel the way I was, but the feeling was almost overwhelming. A few minutes go by and my partner looks at me and says, "Hey man, I don't feel right, something just feels off, do you want to get out of here?" I replied yes, and we got the hell out of there. I have never really figured out why we both had that sensation and why it came on in that church's parking lot, but it sure did give me the creeps. Around 7 years ago I found myself unexpectedly unemployed. I wasn't a truck driver, but I did have a CDL, so was able to get a local job hauling water in a tanker truck from the well to the bottling plant. There were 2 wells in 2 different locations we would go to, one being far more remote and isolated than the other. I rode with one of the guys for a couple days to get training on the procedures. While riding with this guy, he casually mentions that the area the well is in is on land that has a curse and is haunted by some witch. I politely listen and smile and figure he is fucking with the new guy. Well, they typically put the new guys on the longer run in the isolated area, and that's what I ended up doing. I typically went during the day and it was a beautiful forested area with lots of wildlife, pretty enjoyable even though it was isolated. I'd been running loads for a couple months when we got a pretty severe storm, and parts of the roadways to the well were flooded out. I didn't run for a couple days, then dispatch called and asked if I wanted to do a night run. I was ready to get back to work and needed the money, so I said sure. As I made my way to the well, the going was quite slow. In the truck I could get through it, but there were still some spots with some pretty deep water. At a certain point the paved road ended and there was about a 5-mile stretch on dirt road that had a few washouts, some tree limbs laying around, but I finally reached the well. One thing to note is that typically there were a couple trucks at the well, due to a large number of trucks and drivers scheduled to consistently rotate through. But because of the storm, many of the drivers had elected to stay home. So I get there, go in the pump house, do my testing and start filling up the tanker. I do my paperwork as it's filling, everything totally normal. When it's done filling, I crawl up on top to lock everything down. It's when I'm on top of the tanker that my truck and tanker lights all go out, and I'm on top of this thing in basically pitch black night. There is a light in the pump house, and when the door is open it gives off a good illumination around the truck. But simultaneously with the lights of my truck mysteriously going out, there is a gust of wind that slams the pump house door shut. As I'm sitting on top of the tanker wondering what the hell just happened, I swear I heard distant, cackling laughter. The hair on the back of my neck literally stood up. I'd always wondered what the hell that meant, but now I knew. I grabbed my cell phone and turned on the flashlight, making it down the side of the tanker in record time. I ran to the cab and tried to get the lights on, but no go. There was no way I could drive it with no lights, and cell phones didn't get service at the well, so I was stuck waiting for the next driver to arrive. I'm not ashamed to say that I locked myself in the pump house for the next hour and a half while I waited. I used to be a Jehovah's Witness as a kid. That thing where they go around knocking on doors to preach to you, I was doing that with my mom and a few others. We walked up this slanted driveway with trees around each side. They couldn't see my mom and I from the street in the car. We knocked on the door, everything very normal. The man answered the door, still seems normal. Except this time I got hit by something I couldn't see. My ears started ringing and buzzing like crazy. It felt like a helmet had been put on. My body was screaming at me to leave. The man listened to my mom's intro, then said he was interested in hearing more, and invited us in like some do. All those things got so much stronger. The air felt like it got dense to keep me from moving. My mom looked at me and she said I looked off. Pale and distant. She told him that I seemed to be ill and that we should just leave. As soon as we stepped onto the ground in view of the car, I was completely fine. My mom decided to take me home anyway. We lived 2 blocks away. A few days later we read in the paper about how that man was arrested for rape and murder of a few women. I think one of them was as young as 16. I was 12 at the time. My mom, dutiful witness she was at the time, was convinced the angels stepped in to protect us like we had heard stories of happening to others in the religion. That Jehovah used them to make me feel off to keep us safe. I was driving back from a trip with a friend and my kids. My baby was screaming, so I pulled into a gas station to change her and nurse her in the car. The store was very rural, but maybe 10 cars still there. They were closing as I was feeding her. I stood up and laid her in my driver's seat to change her diaper when a pickup truck with 2 men pulled up behind me. They were talking to one another and smiling the nastiest, creepiest smiles at me. I stared back for what felt like eternity. I handed my baby across to my friend and reached in my glove box and pulled out my 380 and kept it in the seat and never broke eye contact. They must have recognized the motion I made. They peeled out after that. I have no doubt they were going to try and harm us. Back when I was in college, a friend of mine showed up to hang out a few times with all kinds of bruises on his face, cuts, split lip, etc. He said it was some idiot at a party that he got into a fight with, but it kept happening, so I called bullshit. Finally I drug it out of him. He was going to an underground fighting ring, some backyard brawler shit, to make some extra money. So I convinced him to take me with him. I wanted to get in on it. I grew up in rough neighborhoods and fought a lot when I was younger, so I figured I could hold my own. So I went a few times and I did pretty good. I won 3 fights and made a little extra cash. The last time we went though, as we were leaving, we saw this kid that had lost his fight surrounded by a bunch of dudes afterwards. He didn't have the money to back himself. We figured he would just get a beat down, so my friend and I picked up the pace. We were halfway though the parking lot when we heard the kid screaming. I'll never forget that sound. I have no idea what they did to him, but after hearing that we never went back. My wife and I were camping on the Oregon coast and jogged through a guy's campsite that he'd set up on the trail down to the beach. On the way back to our campsite, I jogged a little bit ahead of my wife and she was really upset that I didn't stay with her. She said the guy looked really creepy. We got back to Eugene and got a call from the state police asking if we saw anything strange. We gave an update about the guy camping above the beach and asked why they were calling. They said someone had drowned an off-duty policewoman in a tidal pool, cut their tent lines and stolen her car. Turned out to be a serial killer who'd been killing people while traveling across the country. They caught him in Southern California a few weeks later. We definitely got the dodged a bullet feeling. When I was a teenager, I was awoken to a sudden chaos in my house. I come out of my room to see my dad, but naked except for his red wings, with a pistol in his hand, absolutely tearing through the house towards the front door. My mother swoops me out of the way and locks me in and herself into my sister's room. Apparently someone was trying to break into my window and had not realized my parents' window was right by mine. My dad woke up, grabbed the gun and chased the dude down the street naked with a gun at 3 a.m. Screaming, "I'm going to find you, motherfucker." Cops come, police helicopter involved, the whole 9 yards. Turns out the dude was some wanted person who'd been outside my window long enough to have smoked a half pack of cigarettes. Probably the only reason he didn't get in was that we had storm windows. Which is what he was trying to pry off when my dad woke up. They did end up getting him hiding in a neighbor's shed. If you guys like this video, please drop a like and subscribe, and also check out my Instagram account Scary Time that is linked in the description, and as always, stay scary.